Inserting data into the database is obviously an important task, so SQL has multiple ways of doing that. The most common way is insert values. Switching to CHA2 database, and give us some more room. So the basic syntax here is insert into, and into is optional, so you'll see I leave that off sometimes. And the table we're inserting, and then a list of the columns that will receive the data, and then values, and the values that will go into the columns. They just match up one for one. And then here's diver whitewater rafting going into qualifications. So we'll execute this, and diver Dan is now in the database. Here's just another example. And then if we look at the guide table, you'll see indeed diver Dan, Tammy, and Jeff are all there. So this is the code that will be sent to SQL Server, probably from the front-end application, whether that's a web application or a .NET application. I mentioned that the list of columns to receive the data is optional. And of course you can ignore that list of columns and just still put the data in. If you ignore the column listing, you then have to supply data for every column in the orders defined inside the table. You can't leave anything out. And it's a best practice to leave that column listing in there. And of course we can use expressions. So here we're using an expression to concatenate rock climbing and first aid. And I guess rock climbing and first aid are good qualifications to have in one person, huh? And you'll see later when we start working with T-SQL that you can put variables in the expressions as well. So execute this, check to make sure he's there, and sure enough. So that's inserting from a list of values. We can also insert directly from a select statement. So switching over to OBX kites, and here's a select statement that pulls data from the CHA2 database, the guide table, and we can insert from the guide table into the contact table. Works great. Typically, to analyze data, you'll have to pull data from one table to another table. Sometimes for ETL, extract, transform, load, you'll be using this type of syntax. And some developers like to work with temporary tables, which we'll talk about in the T-SQL lesson. So you will use an insert select often to populate and then retrieve from temporary tables as well. While we haven't talked about creating stored procedures yet, it's also possible to insert directly from the result or output of a stored procedure. So to demo this, I'll switch back to CHA2. This is just a simple stored procedure called list guides, and this stored procedure will execute two select statements, returning the results of both of those. So create the stored procedure. Just to execute the stored procedure so you can see the result of it. It sends back two result sets. Since we're going to be inserting, let me create a table to receive the results of that. So the syntax now is insert into, I left that out, guide sample, the table we just created, listing out the columns, execute list guides. What will happen is SQL Server will run the stored procedure, the results set will come back and go into list guides. Then if we check the contents of the guide sample table, you'll see that everything is there. So it's important to note that if a stored procedure returns more than one result set, basically all the result sets are placed into the table using the insert execute syntax. The fourth method of inserting data is the select into. Now, select into is different than any of the other inserts we've done so far. Select into is different for a couple of reasons. First, select into bypasses the transaction log and functions as a bulk logged behavior. So we need to go ahead and turn on the option to allow select into and bulk copy. And because it's a bulk logged behavior, it'll affect your recovery plans and the way you do backups and restores. Another thing that's different about select into is it actually creates a table on the fly. So to set this up, I'll make sure I'm in the same database, and yes I am. Set up the database for recovery mode full and allow select into bulk copy. And here's our select into statement. To walk through it, it says select. We're going to select a list of columns. I just have asterisk here for simplicity's sake. And then into DBO guide list. And it will create a table called DBO guide list. Let me comment out the into guide list first, just to run this select so we can see the results. Those are the guides. And now execute the select into. Nothing is returned. There's no result set. It just says 8 rows affected. And it created a table called DBO guide list. So SP help and then guide list, the name of the table, will give us a full dump of information about that table. We can also see it in the Object Explorer. So open this up, and I'm on the second instance at the moment, so here's CHA2, tables, and here's the guide list. Look at properties. You'll see it was just created. And looking at the columns, and all of the columns from DBO guide were copied over into guide list. So there's guide ID, last name, first name, qualifications, and a couple of dates. One of the gotchas here is that you cannot use select into if the table already exists, because it wants to create a table. So for example, if we come back and execute this again, that will definitely blow up, because there's already an object called guide list in the database. Now the guide table has an identity column, which is a surrogate primary key, and the identity column generates a new number automatically for every row as a primary key. So just to test that identity column, inserted a new row, and then select. And as you can see, even the identity column was moved over. And there I am as guide ID 9. Speaking of identity columns, they can create a problem when you're inserting. So let's talk about that for a second. Now the guide table, as we just said, has an identity column on it. So if we wanted to force a value, here we're forcing the value of 10 into guide ID. And what do you think is going to happen? Exactly right. We cannot insert a value if there's an identity column, because SQL Server wants to generate that value all by itself. Sometimes this is a problem if you need to copy data from one table to another table. You want to populate a database with data from an ETL extract, transform, load process. Sometimes you need to temporarily turn off that identity column so that you can insert into it and maintain those values for referential purposes. The way to do this with SQL Server is to set identity insert for a table on. And this makes sense, even though it sounds strange at first, but we're turning on the ability to insert into the identity, which in effect is turning off the identity. I know that sounds strange, let me say it one more time. To turn off the automatic identity, you turn on identity insert. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now that identity insert is turned on, we can go ahead and insert Bill with an ID of 10. And there's already a 7 in there, so that's still going to be blocked. Just to illustrate that turning off the identity does not turn off the primary key constraint. If we set Sue to say 77. Now that would work just fine. And with identity insert turned on, if we try to insert without providing a value, that too will give us a problem because it needs a value there for the primary key. So if we turn identity insert off, which turns the identity column back on, now we can go back to our normal way of inserting without specifying the primary key. So those are sort of the tricks of the trade of working with identity columns and inserting with the identity column turned on or turned off. And just so you can see, all the data did eventually make it there. Fantastic.